Supreme Court is, and they don't seem like they're in a big hurry to be adjudicating the question as to whether the leading contender for the Republican nomination is allowed to even run for president because of his involvement in what I think anyone reasonable would have to call an insurrection, or, I think even arguably a coup attempt in some respects. But walk us through. This is all centered around the 14th Amendment, Section 3. Colorado has deemed Trump ineligible for the general election. Same too with Maine, is my understanding. What are the implications of this case? Will it affect other states? If the Supreme, but go ahead.
Sure. So, the Colorado Supreme Court and the Maine Secretary of State have both held that Donald Trump cannot appear on the ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And that reasoning applies to both the primary and the general election. Okay. Section 3 has a provision which states that any person who has previously taken the oath of office and then engages in insurrection or rebellion against the United States is disqualified from holding any office, civil or military, in the future unless Congress grants him amnesty by a 2/3 vote. Now, as you said, I think it's very clear that Trump engaged in insurrection. He incited the attack on the Capitol. He fomented the obstruction of counting of electoral votes. The deeper questions here really, I think, involve the process by which Trump could be knocked off the ballot. And you sort of hinted at that just a second ago. I think it's the right question to ask. We have Colorado and Maine rendering these decisions. What about other states like Michigan, for instance? Well, in those states, there's not as clear a path for voters to challenge someone's inclusion on the ballot. And so those courts have not allowed Trump to be knocked off the ballot or even seriously entertained the question. And this may be the biggest issue here. Congress has not laid out any clear procedure by which a insurrectionist can be taken off the ballot anywhere. And so one of Trump's main arguments is that Congress needs to pass some kind of statute explaining how the 14th Amendment should be enforced here. And that even if that's not right, that he wasn't afforded due process in Maine or in Colorado, that he deserved like a full trial, a fuller hearing, more notice and process before he was removed from the ballot. And those are the questions that the Supreme Court's going to confront in exactly 1 month.
We had a caller yesterday who called in and told us that there was part of Section 3 that was actually repealed by Congress in the wake of Reconstruction that presumably was a mechanism in which to determine if someone was an insurrectionist. Like, this was passed specifically in response to the Civil War and to people who were fighting for the South, for the Confederacy. They were engaging in insurrection against the United States of America. And then there was part that was repealed that ostensibly was about, like, what was it? Was it defining who was in that, or that made it that in some ways it seems to me made it more applicable to Donald Trump than less, but go ahead.
So Congress can't repeal a constitutional amendment on its own, right? That's not legally possible. But what Congress did during Reconstruction was pass a very broad amnesty act. Remember before I said that Congress could lift this restriction by a 2/3 vote? Congress enacted by a 2/3 vote this sweeping amnesty for Confederates who had participated in the Civil War. Basically, had a bit of a change of heart. More racists were in Congress. Everybody wanted the North and the South to get along so they could go back to being racist together. And Congress said, we're just going to let these former Confederates do whatever they want, pretty much, including run for and hold public office. So we're going to grant very broad amnesty to all of them. Now, the argument that I think this caller made, which is one that Trump has made as well, is that the Amnesty Act that Congress enacted back then projects forward indefinitely. That Congress didn't just grant amnesty to former Confederates, but actually effectively lifted the ban in Section 3 on insurrectionists holding office by granting future amnesty to everyone who engages in an insurrection moving forward. I think that is a very weak argument. First of all, as I said before, it would basically mean that Congress was repealing a constitutional amendment, was repealing Section 3 by legislation. That's not really legally possible. But also, I think it defies common sense that when Congress was looking backward and trying to give former Confederates more leeway to run for office, that it was also somehow looking ahead to the future, granting this permanent amnesty to insurrectionists who participated in an insurrection that hadn't even happened yet. I think that's a very weak argument. I don't think it's one that the Supreme Court will embrace.
What's the strongest argument that you think Trump has to avoid disqualification in these instances?
Well, I think the strongest argument is a policy argument, not a legal argument, which is that we're in uncharted territory here, and removing the top Republican contender from the ballot would shatter a lot of people's belief in democracy, including, I think, a lot of non-Trumpists who believe that whatever the 14th Amendment says, the American people deserve to have a vote here, and that a handful of judges and state officials shouldn't be able to unilaterally remove him from the ballot. But the Supreme Court says...
Let me just say something. I mean, that is a typical liberal, namby-pamby, living constitution. That's not what the text says.
Exactly
Mark.
right.
That is not what the text says. And I am a newfound originalist and textualist, and I don't care what the outcomes are. That's not my job as the judge to think about what the implications of any type of ruling are. I'm just going by what's in the text by the founding fathers of the framers of our Constitution. And so
balls and strikes, baby.
Balls and strikes.
So, I mean, you got me. I don't know what to say. I think that you've also kind of got the quandary that the Supreme Court is in because, of course, the originalist conservative majority has claimed that they don't care about policy or politics or even outcomes, right? In the big Second Amendment case 2 years ago when the court struck down bans on open carry, it said, look, judges shouldn't even look to whether gun restrictions are saving lives. It is not our business whether this has a positive outcome. All that we can look at is what people understood this to mean in 1791. And so I think if you go by that reasoning, there are really very few good arguments to keeping Trump on the ballot. I think there are few good arguments why Trump should be able to remain. I think that the original meaning of Section 3 was very clearly designed to be anti-democratic in a sense, right? The people who ratified Section 3 of the 14th Amendment thought that maybe the future voters of America couldn't be trusted to keep insurrectionists out of office. And so we needed a constitutional bar, just like they thought we needed a constitutional bar on presidents running and holding office for more than 2 terms or running for office before the age of 35. There are other restrictions in the Constitution. This appears to be one of them. I will say, if I'm just putting my legal hat on, I think that the best constitutional argument that Trump has here is that the way this has gone so far in Colorado and Maine, maybe in a few more states, we'll see, it does feel rather freewheeling and improvised. What the voters in Colorado did who challenged Trump's placement on the ballot was use this procedure that's usually done to say, like, a school board candidate isn't sitting in the right district. Like, their house is a mile over the line, and so they can't run for the school board seat. They used that process to force a hearing on whether Trump engaged in insurrection and was thus disqualified from holding office. A lower court state trial judge in Colorado held that hearing, drew her conclusions, And basically, that was the basis of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. A similar thing in Maine. The Maine Secretary of State held a very informal hearing. Evidence was put forth, and she just sort of decreed, yes, this was an insurrection, and Trump incited it. That's not usually what due process entails. Certainly not for criminal matters. This is not a criminal matter. It's more like a civil matter. But even then, I'm concerned that there aren't any clear safeguards here that would, for instance, prevent a red state from trying to weaponize its own judiciary to keep, say, Joe Biden off the ballot by claiming that he aided the enemy by allowing too many migrants to cross the border and persuading a ultra-conservative judge in state Supreme Court to knock him off the ballot. I think that what we would really like to see here is Congress step in and define these terms and define the specific process by which Section 3 is applied. If that happened, I think everybody challenging Trump would be on much firmer ground. In the absence of that, it does feel a little bit iffy to me.
That part also, that's where I think I think that's ultimately where they're going to rule. I mean, that to me strikes me too. Like, to have a magistrate determine what the threshold is for insurrection at that point. But what if the Supreme Court finds that, like, the process in which to determine, even though it's not necessarily, you don't have to get to the bar of a criminal charge here because it's just a classification of something relative, not as to whether they go to jail, but whether they're eligible, if they're insurrection-y enough to not be eligible for the ballot. But what if, like this case that Jack Smith is involved in, the election interference one? I mean, what if it's found that he's not immune from it and he's found guilty? And I don't think that case will actually be resolved in time. But theoretically, would the Supreme Court be basically saying, like, we're going to bring this back down, and we need a better process for how to determine the insurrection? Because they can't also say there is no provision here, like that part of the Constitution is like an appendix. Like, it's just some vestige of a bygone era and it's not doing anything. So there, we never pay attention to the 14th Amendment, to the Section 3, unless Congress does something else, right? I mean, they can't really say that, can they?
Well, I mean, they can say that. They have said that about the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state, for instance. But I take your point. And I think that the deeper concern here from the justice's perspective would be that they would kick the can down the road if they did that, rather than sort of definitively resolve this, at least for the 2024 election. If they say there wasn't enough process, or this wasn't defined clearly enough, or we aren't entirely sure what this means and we need more hearings or briefings or research or whatever, that just gives progressives more space and time to come back around and say, okay, well, we did everything you asked, and we still think that Trump needs to be removed from the ballot. I think that if the court takes this route, what it'll probably say is that Section 3 is not self-executing. That is a legal term, which means that Congress actually has to pass legislation that specifically enforces the insurrectionist bar through a very specific process. Congress would have to define what insurrection means, again, sort of lay out how you can go to court and challenge someone, how states can have the authority to remove somebody from the ballot. That would be, I think, essentially killing off Section 3, because we all know Congress isn't going to do that. When will there ever be 60 votes in the Senate to enforce Section 3 by creating this kind of structure? But it would be a kind of statesman-like way, I'm using air quotes there, for John Roberts to resolve this case while pretending to adhere to the Constitution, but really addressing the underlying policy concerns.